Namaskar and good morning to everyone. We are delighted to inform that Symbiosis Law School Noida with SAB and partners has organized a webinar series titled Master Series Corporate M&A Transactions in the month of December 2020. Two sessions have already been delivered on two varied topics as key corporate M&A transactions, including joint ventures, share securities acquisitions, and business transfers. And then second on financing transactions, NCDs, corporate bonds, structured loans, securitization. Masterclass on corporate M&A transaction will be delivered by Mr. Hardeep Sachdeva, Senior Partner, SAB and Partners. Today's topic is business transactions, wherein he'll be deliberate upon the varied aspects of manufacturing agreements, digital supply, sourcing, purchase agreements, joint developments. I would pass on the baton to Mr. Rajneesh Jindal, who is moderating today's session, to explain the rules of housekeeping to the August gathering. Over to you, Mr. Rajneesh.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. And good morning, everyone. On behalf of Symbiosis Law School Noida, I welcome you all to this third session of Masterclass on corporate mergers and acquisition transactions. So I would like to announce the rules of housekeeping. So question and answer session will take place once the discussion is over. So participants will be asked to raise their hands, and then they have to unmute and they have to switch on their videos. And after asking the question, all of you are requested to please turn off your camera and go to mute mode. So without taking much of your time, so I would like to hand over the reign of this masterclass once again to the master of this domain. So over to you, Hardeep, sir.
Good morning. Many thanks. I just had a question to ask to maybe Rajneesh, maybe to Dr. Yu. Why is the attendance so low this time? It started with a very high attendance on the two sessions before. It was still very good in the last session as well, but today I can see far thinner attendance.
May I explain that, sir? Yeah. Because the second and third years have their exams. So second year's exam get over today by 11:30. So they would come in, and the third years have their exam from 2 o'clock. So few of them would get in. So you could see after a while the number will increase then. So second years would be joining.
But but I must clarify, I'm not complaining. I was just curious about the number of students who may have joined this time. It is absolutely.
No, it is just because of that, sir. Nothing else. Otherwise, we are receiving overwhelming response from the professionals and the industry as well, and from the student community, sir. Over to you, sir.
Yes, thank you very much. And I think the most obvious question I would like someone to ask today is that why are we doing these sessions on the corporate M&A transactions or this subject? What is the relevance of it while you people are studying law? And when you study law, what I've seen is that your subjects are based on a statute or one field of law. So I've seen that your curriculum is based on a contract law as an example, or jurisprudence, or the tax. So why are we doing something which is not fully aligned to what your topical subjects are? I mean, of course, your subject has to be the entire field of law end of the day, and not just picking up a statute. If I can give a bit of a background here, I mean, even before somebody can ask the question, is that whenever me and Dr. Ramalde meet, we always discuss that, sorry, I have a bit of a throat. We always discuss that we need to tell our students what will happen after they qualify 5th year, after they become lawyers, what will happen next. So one of the things that they have to get ready is to keep in their mind concussion of the entire laws or multiple laws that they have read and start using them together when they are giving any advice to any client. So giving advice means the moment you become lawyers, the moment you are practicing law, you are advising your clients in the field of law. So when you advise your client for any field of law or any aspect here, You just cannot say that I only know the Contract Act section 1 to 34, or I do not know the Companies Act section from so on to so and so. You need to wear a hat where you need to keep yourself fully abreast to all the relevant cross sections of various statutes that may be applicable in any piece of work that you're doing. So as far as this piece is concerned, we have picked up a corporate field, let's say corporate law field, where one can practice. In the corporate law field, we picked up what are the most relevant areas that we practice law. So it's all about practicing law. And then we thought about, when we speak about corporate M&A practice, what all it includes. So it includes, amongst other things, transactions that we work upon. Therefore, we devised this short curriculum for the students to understand what transactions, or what are those transactions, or what goes into these transactions that we work as corporate M&A lawyers. Now, these transactions, as I think I mentioned 2 sessions ago as well, these could be never ending in terms of how much we can speak about them. But still we categorize them into 3 key categories, which are the important ones. Important ones to understand that the most of the transactions that we work in will fall in one of these 3 categories. And then these 3 categories are largely interwoven to each other. So it is not just that you will have a transaction that you will work after you become a lawyer, or even during your internship. You may work with a team of any lawyers in any law firm on any corporate M&A transaction. You may still pick up one small piece of it. You may still work in a joint venture transaction. You may work only in the security investment transaction. You may still be part of a financing transaction, but you need to understand the interweaving of these transactions from a corporate lawyer's perspective. Therefore, we had put together this, quick curriculum for you to just tell you more about what goes into these corporate M&A transactions. And if I can still summarize for you, we spoke about these 3 categories. First category was the key, and I picked up the word key because there could be many more different nomenclatures or different transactions that may go into this list here. The key corporate M&A transactions, we categorize those 3 for you. Then we picked up the 3 financing transactions. Again, I spoke about the corporate bonds last time at length. Why I spoke about corporate bond last time at length? Because the corporate bonds are the flavor of the season. The flavor of the season means here is that I showed you press reporting, which shows that the debt raised or the financing raised by Indian corporates through the corporate bonds was more than the financing raised by the Indian corporates through the conventional financing means like bank loans. So how the relevance of corporate bonds is increasing, and therefore how the relevance of the debt transaction and understanding the bond transaction or the NCD transaction is becoming important for corporate lawyers. And some corporate lawyers, people like like us, they are far ahead in the curve when it comes to the understanding of these corporate bond or any of these corporate transactions here. Now, today we will be focusing on the 3rd bucket of these corporate M&A transactions, which is the business transactions. Now, this business transaction is different from the 3rd subset of the first category, which is the business transfer transactions. It is not a business transfer. It is basically the business transactions that I wanted to talk about today, which will be simply the various components of businesses which gets interwoven with the corporate M&A transactions. Now, how it starts, we have to go back to some live examples. Let's say if I give example of a joint venture between Maruti, Indian, government of India, and Suzuki, the car manufacturer of Japan, when they had formed their joint venture way back in early 90s or late 80s called Maruti Suzuki. This joint venture saw a joint venture company had a joint venture. That company had to manufacture cars in India and sell those cars in India. But obviously the company could not have sold cars without a very, very important ingredient to manufacture cars. Now that important ingredient could be, to begin with, your land, your factory, your building, your human resource, your laborers, your licenses. But on the top of all this, what was required was a technology license, a technology to manufacture cars, which were at that point in time could be smaller in size, could be better in speed, could be fuel efficient. And that technology was available with Suzuki. So what happened when the joint venture company was set up, joint venture was made, there was one business agreement signed by the Suzuki Corporation of Japan to give technology to this company to manufacture cars. I'm giving illustration, so please don't take it as if this is what had happened at that point in time. I'm giving you illustration as to how this whole JV had taken off or could have taken off. A joint venture, even if it is set up, it may still require some business support from both the parties, or both the parties may take some business out of it for their corporate reasons for this joint venture to be a successful joint venture. So one of the contribution made by a party was the technology license or a technology transfer for this joint venture company to manufacture cars. So when we speak about the business agreements in a joint venture or for a transactional lawyer, it can be any business agreement or any business arrangement that can be signed by a party to a joint venture or any affiliate or an associate party to the joint venture with the joint venture company. With the joint venture company. Now, just one second. I'm sorry. Yeah. Now, therefore, the relevance of these joint venture company is also dependent on the business arrangements which are usually there in place for making these joint ventures successful. Now, the various categories of these business agreements can be anything. Can be, I picked up 3 categories or 3 broad categories, but you can imagine any amount of business that one corporate can do with other corporate can form its place here. We can start with very basic one, which is the technology transfer agreement or the technology license agreement, where one party or one partner will license the technology with the joint venture company or with the other partner to license its technology to manufacture any product possibly. Now it can be a alcoholic beverage where the owner of the mixture or the formula to manufacture that alcoholic content will license that formula to the joint venture company for the company to make the same beverage with the same formula. So if I can just pick example of, let's say, Coca-Cola bottling plant. So bottler who's bottling Coca-Cola in India, that bottler is getting a license and that formula to manufacture that same Coca-Cola while having a plant set up in Haryana or in UP or in Punjab. And that formula is patented, copyrighted, in whichever way intellectually protected by the owner of the formula in the country where that company is constituted or where the formula is protected. So these very basic or the first level business agreements could be in the form of your technology transfer or a technology license agreement. Second most important agreements, very critical agreements in these joint ventures, I'm sure we all can guess it very easily, is the trade name or a trademark license agreements. So what made, if I go back to my, this very famous example of Maruti Suzuki, what makes Maruti Suzuki car in India as a Maruti Suzuki car? Because Suzuki allowed this joint venture company to use the name, use its brand name, its trademark Suzuki in the name of the brand name of the product made by this company. And that holds good if you look across for anything else. you usually have a trademark license given by one of the joint venture partner to be used by the joint venture company or used by the other partner for the purposes of doing business here. Second very important, business agreement is your trademark licenses or your trade name licenses or your copyright licenses here, by which you basically use that name or borrow that name to do business in India. I mean, in India means that we're speaking about joint ventures or these transactions in India here. A third example could be, and I'm going to give you several examples here today so that we know as to what I'm talking about when we speak about the business arrangements or the business transactions between one partner and other partner or various business agreements that we look at when we do the corporate M&A transactions here. Third example is a supply contract. Now, for any joint venture, it is possible that some of the components or some of the important components of the product being manufactured or being sold in India cannot be made in India or are patented and are made at a far more cost effective and better quality manner in their European market or US market or a Japanese market. So there is always a supply contract under which one partner will agree to supply that component at a pre-agreed price to the joint venture company here, which is again very important part of your joint ventures or your corporate M&A transactions here. Fourth could be just a flip of it, a procurement contract, where the joint venture partner will say, whatever you will manufacture carrying my technology, with my licensing, with my name, I know the market and therefore I agree to buy it from you. You please keep manufacturing it. I'll procure it from you and I'll sell it in the market myself. Because sometimes, or it's not possible that every time when we're doing a JV or we're talking about a JV, we are manufacturing a product which is sold in the market or sold to a customer directly. We always speak about JVs and you always also speak about JVs where the products are manufactured which can be sold to other manufacturers. Therefore, that market is known to one of the partner who is having that expertise or that field to procure it from you and sell in that market. Therefore, your joint venture will be largely meant for the manufacturing part of it. Now, another very important agreement could be, maybe number 5th in the list, could be manufacturing contracts. Now, manufacturing contracts are again equally important. One can set up a joint venture here where one plant can to manufacture. So if I take example of again alcoholic beverages, so one can do a joint venture to to manufacture a new vodka as an example by the joint venture company, which can be branded by the joint venture, which brand can be owned by that joint venture company, and at the same time another partner can be given the license to do the toll manufacturing or do the manufacturing or the bottling for the JVC. And why to do manufacturing for the JVC? Because end of the day, the capacity of the JVC will be limited. To increase the capacity, you need to enhance the manufacturing through the different toll manufacturers. Now, one thing you should all do today, go back and look at the products that you use or look at the FMCG or the consumer durable products that you use today. You will find out that those could be owned or under the brand of some other company, but could have been manufactured by some very different third-party company. And those different third-party companies are called the toll manufacturers who will be manufacturing it for the brand owning company under a manufacturing agreement. To pick up anything, maybe sometimes any Dabur product here, you'll find it is manufactured by somebody which is a third-party company mentioned there, which will say under the license, under the contract with Dabur India Limited. It's an example. So that we pick up anything, you'll find that the manufacturing is done by somebody else who is doing it under a manufacturing contract with licensing for the benefit of the joint venture company or an alliance there. So one of the key component of the business agreements is also this manufacturing agreement here, where you agree to, if I can use the word lend, you basically only license in a limited fashion your technology, your know-how, your processes to a manufacturer to manufacture a product which is to be sold back to you, not to the market, sold back to you or to your pre-designated customers. Now it can be given back to you and you can sell to your customers, but sometimes because of these GSTs and overly complicated, excise rules, you might have to sell only to a customer. It can then be sold to the customer as well, but at your behest. Whereas the manufacturer who is manufacturing it for you will not be exposed to the to that market for the purposes of any recovery of money for the sales. He will still get paid a fees for manufacturing that product that he's manufacturing for you. So that manufacturing contract finds a very key position in the corporate M&A transactions, in the business part of it, in a very business part of it. Now others could be any other business agreement that one can have in place, which could be your any development agreement where one can do any software development, which could be or any marketing agreement where you can do any marketing of your products here, or any sales agreement, any human resource supply agreement, or any other agreement that we can talk about there. It can be, it can start from your leasing agreement where you provide the office. It can be your land agreement where you provide the land. It can be any contribution that one joint venture partner is contributing to the joint venture for the purposes of this joint venture company here. That contribution will find itself in the form of an agreement here, and that agreement is that business agreement which is which could be the origin, which could be the reason for the joint venture, or which could be the contribution in the joint venture, both. Now, could be the reason means that one sometimes is setting up a joint venture to do some other business out of it. So as an example, if let's say if an e-commerce company is doing a joint venture with a physical retail sort of a store company, it could also be that that e-commerce company will get access to its various physical stores available all over the country, and vice versa. And the physical store company will use the strength of the e-commerce company to deliver its products to any customer all over the country, because the logistics and the ease of or the convenience of shopping is available largely with e-commerce than a physical store in that sense. So this could be two very different sort of a business angles can still do business together by finding strength in each other. And this is where business meets business. And these are, the typical business agreements. Now, I picked up one more last category in those three in the form of joint development agreements. Now, let's say it happens largely in real estates where one person has land available with it, but doesn't know what to do with it. And the second person is a real estate developer, but doesn't have land available with it. Therefore, they can still come together, and then the person who has the land can make his land available to the real estate developer, who can do the development on that piece of the land here, can construct a multi-story building. And then how do you compensate to the landowner as part of the joint venture? You can share the total built up area in that building which is to be constructed by the developer. Construction requires your architectural landscaping. It requires obtaining approvals from the government authorities. It also requires, expertise into what to construct, how to construct the market, the feasibility of what you want to construct and sell there. And therefore, you need to have some sort of a joint venture with the landowner, where the landowner's, strength will be available to make the very important basic ingredient for any such real estate, which is the land, where you construct the building here, and therefore you share the upside, share the profit. And any business agreement can be just sharing your profits or sharing your revenues. It can be anything. Other business agreements that we do usually is in any concessions which are granted by the government. So today, if you look at the road concessions, and I'm picking up, just random examples that I thought of just telling you as to what all happens in these things. So let's say in the road concession, what happens? There is one concessionaire company which gets the concession from the government to set up to construct and operate a toll road for a fixed period of time. Now that concessionaire immediately thereafter, after getting the concession to construct that road and then operate the toll for that road for a fixed period of time, that concessionaire goes to a construction company and tells that construction company, which is usually a partner or a part owner of the concessionaire, to construct the road. So road construction, while it is the job of the concessionaire, is not done by the concessionaire by itself. They engage a construction company, which is usually the owner of the part owner of the concessionaire, to construct the road. Then to run the toll on that road, they go to somebody else. There are these toll operator companies, several of them operating in the country, which will run any toll for any concessionaire for a fixed fee or for a percentage of the toll collected. So they will, they will manage the toll booth on that toll operator, and then they'll go to any road maintenance company who will maintain the road. So what is the concessionaire company which has got the concession from the government doing? It is, end of the day, getting all these businesses together and making them work. So by itself may not be constructing the road. This by itself may not be collecting the toll. This company by itself may not be maintaining the road, but this company is the one which has put together all the functions. Through what? Through a joint venture. And what was the joint venture? So usually these toll companies or the road toll companies, they are not companies owned by some unconnected corporates. These companies are usually joint ventures between two key parties to this whole business. And those two key parties, one is the person or the company constructing the road. Second is the company which is putting in the financing for the road here. And why is government giving it to a private road concessionaire? Because the government needs some financing to get the road made. And that financing is then, end of the day, contributed by these large, if you remember my first topic here, large funds, large pension funds, which want to be in this business. For business means the business at that point in time to contribute money, to deploy funds in a road concession, which is for sure keep giving them some assured return. I mean, assured, not guaranteed in that sense, but a road business world over is sort of a business where you earn a reasonable rate of return. Therefore, these two people come together, but they do not have the intent to run the road. The financier has the intent to earn some return on his money. The road construction company has the intent to do the road construction, but not through the joint venture, through another business agreement. So when they won the concession company, which is a joint venture company, gets money from the financier, raises debt from the bank, construct the road. The road construction, which is a larger part of the business right now, is done by the construction company, where the company gets paid for the construction. Then for time to come, this company manages that road, runs, operates a road, collects toll, and then maintains the road. And usually these concessions are for 30 years. Post that, they hand over the road back to the government. And after which it can be a toll-free road, or it can be NHI monitored toll road. And same goes for several other examples that we can have here, where two or more parties will come together and they will have the business arrangements in place, where each contributor or each joint venture party will have their respective business understanding, business reasons to do this joint venture here. No, we can pick up, more examples which are, which are into the joint venture here. But I thought today's session, I want to do, as I first, asked that we must ask ourselves why we doing these sessions, is to understand a holistic picture of what goes into this corporate M&A practice here. A holistic picture is to get some sort of a little satellite view. We of course can get detailed view when you work into a law firm and look at what all we do. But yes, some satellite view as to what gets into these transactions here. This was the whole objective, to tell you as to what all these different components of these transactions that we look at every day in our work life. So every day we speak about joint ventures. Every day we speak about giving reps and warranties or contributions by each party, or what will one party do, what will second party do, who will do what construction, who will do what contributions, which party will get the technology, who will get the trade name, or will there be a new name, new brand for this project here. Every time we do any transaction, these questions are always there. Or when you're making investments only for the purposes of investing into making returns, you always have to protect your rights, protect the leakages of the businesses to third parties. That's equally important. So sometimes when you want to let this joint venture company give business to one of the joint venture partner, you have to keep in mind that there is no business leakage here. It is all done at the arm's length basis. It is not done at the cost of one partner where the other partner is gaining. So in the same example of a road concession, it could not be that the concession company is awarding the construction contract to its key shareholder at a price which is far more than the market price, and therefore the profits to be earned by the concession company are getting squeezed, and therefore getting in the hands of the construction contractor. It will have to be at arm's length basis, so that you still have the profits left out in this company only to be earned by the concession company over a span of maybe 3, 4, 5, 8 years time. So lesser the cost of construction is, more profits you make in time to come, because you have to yet to collect toll, you have to yet to pay off your debt, and you have to yet to give money back to the shareholders. And it's of course it's a long process. It's the gestation of these projects is longer. And what I also thought for today, unfortunately, these things should have been done in person more, and which we could not do. Otherwise, the fun of a lot of these things is to have more and more of interactive, answers. And why interactive? So that I will know that what your pulse is, what you want to know, what you want to understand in these things more, and what I can answer more. And if we can have that more questions done today, that'll be really good, so that we can answer you more and more as to, what are these things. So maybe, I'll request that we can have some more questions done today and more answers, and we get into that sort of a thing more here. What do you think, Doctor?
Yes, Mr. Rajneesh.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you very much for this session, sir. So now I would like to request all of the participants to please raise your hands, and you may please ask your questions.
And then I will request one small thing, Yes, go ahead. You can ask the question. Then after asking questions, switch off the video, so that next question can come. Yeah, and more questions there'll be, better it is for all of us.
Sure, sir. Sure. So, Prishita, I request you to please ask your question. Rakesh, sir, will you please allow them?
Done, sir. Done.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you. Prishita, you may please ask your question.
Thank you, Rajneesh sir. Good afternoon. I am Prishita Chadda, fourth year learner. At the outset, I would like to thank Hardeep sir for a wonderful series of lectures, and of course Ravande sir for offering us this opportunity. I'm sure everyone will be taking away a significant amount of knowledge from these master classes, as I am. So my question is, how is the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code going to be a catalyst for more corporate restructuring in India, since the objective of IBC is to revive first before going for dissolution?
Thank you. So I must say that the IBC is not catalyst for the corporate restructuring in my view. I think it could be catalyst for the the resolution of insolvency only. So one doesn't restructure the corporate in the IBC. One maybe buy out the companies through the IBCs, if one can say a buyout or a bid out or sell out the companies. So yes, as I think I mentioned last time, over some 1.5 lakh, 2 lakh crore rupees have been recovered by the banks through the IBC processes. Means so many companies have already been sold to third parties where so much of loan has already been recovered and NPAs are recovered through these resolutions happen through IBCs. It will remain a very, very important and very critical tool for our country and our economy for resolving the insolvencies in India. Very important. Some of the large insolvencies, I'm sure you all would know, have been resolved. Are these steel companies, or Bhushan Steel, or your SR Steel, or these big cement companies, Benani Cement, etc., etc. All these are taken over by, as you know very well, could be Astar, could be Tata's, could be others, Jindal Steel. So these are all, and these companies we speak about 30,000 crore, 40,000 crore rupees of amounts are contributed by the buyer of these companies. Contributed to whom? Contributed to the creditors of the insolvent companies. So this thing will continue, and this simply means that the banks who were seeing large NPAs and staring at a zero sort of a recovery end of the day recover large amount of their funds. Huge amount of money has been recovered by the banks here. It will remain very important for recovery of the money for the creditors from the insolvent companies or the companies getting into insolvencies here. It will remain. And also I can tell you, for us corporate lawyers, I mean, this can be a topic one day we can discuss as to how one of the biggest source of corporate M&A transactions I mean, it may not be in that sense a real corporate M&A, but a big source of the corporate M&A transaction for us also have been the bidding of these companies in the insolvencies. So we have been working for bidders where we have been managed to successfully buy the companies under insolvency, where you will, of course, you will put up a price based on what you feel what the value of the company is and what you feel what are the expectations of the creditors are and what you feel what the competing bid could be. A combination of these basically can get you that corporate which otherwise would have been far more priced in the normal market. So this will remain one of the last source of the corporate M&As or the catalyst of, let's say, the financing in this country here.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Next question is from Arjun Sahni. So Arjun, please ask your question.
A very good afternoon, sir. My name is Arjun Sahani. I am a fourth year law student here. First of all, sir, thank you so much for this session and the other two sessions as well. And I believe I say it on behalf of all of us that these sessions have been really, really helpful for all of us. So my question is that recently, Apple put its manufacturing company Wistron on probation because, according to Apple's investigation, it claimed that Wistron has failed to pay its employees, and that is what caused the riot at the Wistron facility in Bangalore. However, Wistron has claimed that it was not its fault, but it was the fault of several hiring and supplying firms which failed to pay the employees. Given that Wistron and Apple have a manufacturing agreement between them, and the matter is still under investigation, by what legal provisions and by what specific provisions under manufacturing agreements can a company put another company on probation or on hold with respect to certain business, given that the matter is still pending and under investigation? Thank you, sir.
Yeah. See, for these probations or suspensions or maybe downgrading one partner against others, this is what is done by, let's say, proposed to be done by the brand owner to a manufacturer, is done under their respective contracts. This is what the business agreement that I spoke about. So there must have been one manufacturing contract under which this manufacturer would have been manufacturing for and under the licenses and names of the trademark owner, in this case Apple. And under that agreement, there would have been clauses where the brand owner or the principal can tell the agent that I will put you in probation if I find you, forget that the government finds you, if I find you under any violation of any law. And it is not uncommon in these agreements. So what happens is that between a brand owner and the manufacturer, one cannot wait for the decision of the government authority to come for any violation. It has to be the decision formed or made by one corporate against the other, by which one corporate can put the other partner or a vendor in this case under any other scheme that they are conceiving here. In this case, they're calling it probation. And probation in this simply means that if you were supposed to be a full-fledged vendor of mine, right now you are not. I will be watching you more. I will be doing some more forensic on you. I'll be doing some more supervisory on you. And therefore, you can still continue working for me. I'm not firing you, but you're not there as of now. This all is under the contract between the two companies. Now, is that contract enforceable under law in India? Then we need to go back and check, is there anything in this contract which is violative of the Indian Contract Act or any policy of India? The answer is, on the face of it, no, it is not. When two parties are doing business here and one party is telling other party that I will make you my grade A manufacturer or a grade B manufacturer, I am fully entitled to give that grading to my contractors as per my scheme here, because I am not availing any concession of law or any protection of law for these grading of contract here. I am not manufacturing any product which is manufactured under requirement of a licensing of the government of India. These are free trade products here, and these are free trade agreements. I mean, free trade in the sense, not free trade agreements between two companies, between two companies. And therefore, these contracts are fully enforceable in in India as well. And therefore, their imposition of seeking one manufacturer to be under probation because of this incidence being happened here. And this incidence happened here is not hidden anywhere. It is so visible, so reported, where to the extent of casualties happened, fire occurred, all these things happened and are reported there. And that's good enough case for the principal to tell his vendor that I will put you under probation.
Perfectly understood, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for elaborating this particular point in a very wonderful manner. So now I would like to request Mr. Utkarsh Jain to please ask your question, Utkarsh.
Hello, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, Utkarsh, you are audible, Utkarsh.
Good afternoon, sir. Personally, I'd like to thank you very much for the lectures that you've given. It's been really insightful for me, as I do want to pursue a career in it, as I'm sure it was for other students. Sir, my question for you is related to the business transactions between the corporations, as you mentioned in this lecture only. Sir, in India, we don't have a formal method like the Japanese model, the Keiretsu model, in which they have very strong interconnectivity between corporations and also have very strong connections with public financial institutions such as banks and all. So, sir, these like corporate business transactions don't go as smoothly as they are supposed to be, and there are very high chances of financial frauds relating to these. I'd like to name a few. If sir, in the case of, even if we say that Harshad Mehta scam, they were basically interbank business transactions, but the stockbroker in between, the functioning didn't go as smoothly. So, sir, in India, why can't we adopt such a model, such as a Japanese model, for those transactions?
So maybe I want to ask a question to myself, and I can answer, is that, are we saying that India is the only country where financial fraud happens?
No, sir, of course not.
Yeah. No, you don't have to answer that. You can switch off the camera. Is that, have you, I'm sure we all would have heard of the escape of a business fugitive in the recent past. So there was this company called Nissan Motor, whose CEO, Ghoshal, who was held captive in Japan for the biggest ever financial fraud happened against this Japanese company. That person flee Japan in a ship while he was in jail. So it can happen anywhere. Imagine one of the biggest story if you just you have to do a Google as to how Goshan left Japan despite of the Japanese government and the entire police force was after him, and they're still fighting. Yeah, they're still fighting the extradition treaty for him. So I will not really give any gold medal to any country to that extent. Financial frauds can happen anywhere. I think we have very strong, solid, robust systems in place to prevent the financial frauds. It still happens. It still happens in India. It can still happen anywhere else as well. And I can tell you one more thing that I am privileged to manage to do a lot of work in European market, or some bit in America as well. I will not say that they are far more. I mean, the systems are far more better than India. Of course, systems are better, no doubt. But are they foolproof? They may not be foolproof there as well. May not be. So when you ask them as well, when you talk to them as well, you'll find frauds happen there as well. It happens here as well. So it's that Tom and Jerry. You have to just keep running, and you'll have somebody keep chasing you. And what are we doing about it? India keep evolving its laws. They are very dynamic. They keep amending it, keep changing it to make sure that we have more and more efficiencies being created, and we can plug the loopholes in it. But having said that, have we reached to a stage where we can say that we have all the efficiencies possible, and do we have the most conducive environment for starting a business here? I don't think so. We have not reached there. I don't think we are we have very conducive environment right now as well. Very means that, is it that quick start that we can give to any company to start its business? Not necessarily. Till today, if you want to set up a manufacturing plant here, or if you want to set up if you want to construct a building here, you might have to take approvals which can run into tens and could be into hundreds in number. And then even if you take all the approvals known to you, you will still find out after you have completed your construction, you will find out by the government department that there was one more approval which you had to take, which you did not take, which is not that easily available in the public domain. So this is something that we're still struggling with. I think which time and again has been highlighted back to all departments that we need like a single window clearance, that once you have got this clearance, it means that as far as the government departments are concerned, they'll give you a clear check in the box that this is done. You don't have to come back to us. You are good to go. Otherwise, there are so many examples I can give you. Maybe I'll give you some examples which are hilarious stories. I'm sure we all would have seen Delhi Aerocity. Delhi Aerocity had 12 business districts. These are hospitality districts, out of which I think there are 10 hotels and 2 are the real estate buildings, commercial office buildings here. These were allotted by Delhi International Airport Authority through its JV company. It was actually given by Airport Authority of India through Delhi International Airport Limited, which is a company, to these concessionaires to complete the construction of their hotel and to run the hotel for 60 years or so. Whatever the period is, I'm not on that. I'm just on the, on the approvals that were required for this thing. So everybody, or maybe out of those 10 hotels, I think some 10 hotels in these 2 buildings, I think some 8 or 9 were completed, ready to cut the ribbon to start the operations. Just before they could have done that, the government came back and told them, no, all of your buildings are not properly made. You should have done the double glazing of your glasses when you are facing the airport. After the buildings were completed, ready to start the commence the operations, when the hotels were ready to welcome their first guest, they were told, hang on a minute, you cannot do it. Why? Because the glass that you have put in the front of the when it is looking at any part of the airport or the runway, it should have been not X, it should have been double X. So I will not let you open that. These are the kind of shocks that one doesn't want. I mean, you could have given that sort of your directive, your guidance to all these people who have completed their projects here at the right time. And this keeps happening, and not one. There are so many examples that I can give you where after the completion of the project, when the company gets a notice saying that no, you missed out this one thing here, which was never told to them before, while they obtained all the approvals conceivable possible for that project there, that is not in the best interest of the business here. So that environment needs to change, where there is one single approval granted and telling them, yes, this is what you're supposed to check in the box. Make sure you're following these 25, 30, 40, 100, 5,000 things. Please go ahead and do it. And after that, you don't need anything from us. That is what clarity that we need here. That we don't have. But yes, I think government is working towards it. All the time we keep talking about it. As much as possible, you will find this clarity also coming.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, sir. Sir, actually, if you allow, so I just want to add only one thing in this discussion, because the issue is basically about the corporate governance and specifically in M&A. So there was an interesting research conducted by one professor of Harvard Business School, Professor Eugene Solthus, upon 50 topmost white-collar criminals. Okay, so he spent actually the time with the white-collar criminals in the jail. So he actually researched all these points, why basically the persons who are sitting at the top, because obviously the CEOs, when they are sitting at the top, when they have everything with them, so why they do all these kind of, you can say, white-collar crimes. So in this book, why they do it, inside the mind of white-collar crime, the one major interesting outcome was not even a single person was repenting that they have, even they were not accepting that they have committed any wrong. They were simply saying, we did whatever was the requirement of the time or whatever was the requirement of the society. So we did whatever was required from us because you consider us as a god of our field and we did whatever we supposed to be correct. So when you mentioned that no system is perfect, no one is perfect, then obviously this research as well basically mentions only one thing. Nothing is imperfect, nothing is perfect actually. So we can try, and in Indian context, basically, the government is basically trying it very hard to make it more, you can say, robust kind of system. So you absolutely correctly mentioned this point, sir. So thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
But there, I have one small thing to add. Rajneesh, there is that obviously people can say that they have done it in the interest of in the interest of, let's say, the corporate, in the interest of business. But then there are always two things. One, if there is a money trail establishes where the money has reached to that person committed crime, then obviously he has done something which is not right. So in some white collar crimes, when people or when these people working have actually taken some, hundreds of millions of dollars in their personal capacity, which is the fraud committed here, then that fraud cannot be justified just by saying that they have done something in the interest of the business because they had to do something to get the business going, may not be justifiable in that sense. But yeah, they all admit, yeah.
Absolutely correct, sir. But the point, sir, in this research, it is what I highlighted that in case of white collar crimes, the result is not basically visible to the criminal because see, in case of traditional crimes, when, for example, if I am going to hit anyone, so I can perceive the result of that hitting. But in case of white collar crimes, you cannot perceive, you cannot have this sense what will be the impact of your decision which you are going to take because you cannot perceive that person, the victim in front of you. So that was the main point, sir, in this research. That's why they simply say we have never done any mistake. But when we stand at the other side of the victim, then we simply say you cannot just simply take this excuse, obviously, sir. So now I would like to request Devanshi to please ask your question, Devanshi.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, sir. Firstly, I would like to thank you for these informative series of sessions, and it was really helpful for us, and it did give us a practical insight to the M&A transactions that are taking place. So, sir, my question pertains to that in the past, we have seen many banks being merged, and even the government has pointed out a lot of benefits for this same. So, sir, I would like to ask you that as an expert in the field, what is your take on the banking system consolidating in India, and do you think that this trend will continue in the future for specifically the banking sector, and is there any possibility for any other sector in India specifically? And so secondly, what are the demerits and merits of this kind of consolidation as per you?
So may I add one point here? Because the question is with respect to the banking. So how would you also explain the failure of IDFC and the Shriram Finance? Because it was the first attempt wherein two non-banking financial companies, then a bank, an infrastructure finance company, they tried to come together and formulate this, but it just failed. It just could not go because, of course, the reasons are known to you. So how would you see in this context? And what is the way ahead? Because end of the day, if we see the government decides, they immediately merge the banks and they just communicate when it comes to the government banks or the public banks or what we call as. But when it comes to structures like this, we always hit the dead end. So what is your opinion in this kind of situation, sir?
Yeah, so I can start by saying that there is lots to be done in the financial services sector, lots to be done. I mean, the consolidation is not yet started the way it should have been done long ago. And why government is consolidating smaller nationalized public sector banks into a bigger bank? Because the smaller nationalized banks were engaged in these extraterritorial discretionary loans, which were getting into large NPAs. And why they were engaged in giving these loans? Not because the bank officials were necessarily corrupt at that point in time, but also because they were under tremendous pressure of the local politicians in a state. So I don't know if you people may have read in recently some member of parliament or MLA in Telangana forced one of the banks to give some 7,000 crore rupee of loan to its own companies, and then which then company was where the company had directors as the house support staff and some unknown people, where the shareholding is owned by, indirectly by a trust which this person was controlling. So these things keeps happening. Therefore, to get a better vigil on the smaller banks and therefore in the financial service market, they had to consolidate these smaller banks which were going out of hand and going out of balance sheets into a larger bank. As far as the private sector banks are concerned, so if you look at it, they keep consolidating smaller banks into bigger banks as far as the government banks are concerned. But also, if you look around, there are various private banks. I think we did talk about it last time. There are various private banks we know, which Reserve Bank of India took over overnight and merged them or put them under one of the large Indian financial institutions. Like, of course, we know this Yes Bank that happened. Before that, the Global Trust Bank, historically, that happened, which was given to Oriental Bank of Commerce. Now, Oriental Bank of Commerce itself is now merged with Union Bank of India, which, where three banks got merged into Union Bank of India, which is your Oriental Bank, your Andhra Bank, and one more bank there. And then one more private sector bank was taken over by Reserve Bank of India and was put it with, I think, with SBI or some other bank in India here. They keep doing it to protect the interest of the public depositors. And they keep doing it only for the interest of public depositors here. And why? And if I can answer why they are not letting, or why, let's say, RBI did not let the Shriram Finance and IDBI merger occur, because Reserve Bank of India does not like a very high degree of private corporate or industrial house participation in, because then they feel that the public depositor money can be utilized for the purposes of one uh, um, one not at arm's length basis corporate house, whereas the public depositor money should have been used at all point in time for onward lending to third parties at arm's length basis. So the Reserve Bank of India frowns upon some of these schemes where they see that one industrial house wants to be in the bank here. I'm sure you would have read recently the whole debate that went out about letting the industrial houses or the corporate houses to get the banking license. So then the question is that what's wrong in, let's say, what's wrong in Reliance, as an example, to get a banking license? That's the question somebody wants to ask and then answer. Is that so? What are we saying here? The India's one of the largest lender to become a bank. Sorry, largest borrower to become a bank. So Reliance is the largest borrower in the country here, having a borrowing of 3-4 lakh crore rupees. And then if they themselves set up a bank here, then you will find that if something has to go wrong, it'll go wrong in such a terrible way that it'll be irreparable. You can't fix it. Whereas when this largest borrower in the country is borrowing from various institutions, where there are various checks and balances in place, where everybody is following their own arm's length basis practice, and therefore letting this operation occur for this India's largest conglomerate. This is how the financial regulator wants it to happen here, and not to let the industrial house by itself to set up a bank and let that bank be serving the private purpose of one corporate or the one corporate group, either of that. That's the reason they do not. So this whole IDBI was two reasons. One is that, of course, RBI never agreed. And then there were some issues on the valuations as well. But why RBI will not agree? They never liked these industrial houses getting into the banking business, because the banking business simply means that you are collecting the public money. And that public money needs to be protected by the regulator. Their sole objective is to protect the public money. And then their own CRR ratios and the reverse ratio cannot do that, because those ratios are minuscule end of the day. 4-5% cannot protect the interest of the entire depositor. Therefore, they have to move quickly, swiftly, to make sure that nobody is bunking a bank in one day. But there is huge headroom here, in my view, for more private banks to come. There is still dearth of capital or loan available to the MSME sector in this country here. I think we did speak about last time. There are these new age companies coming today, which are into guaranteeing the loans of MSME sector. I think we spoke about it last time, where how these MSME, the micro and small and medium companies, can still avail loan here, which are running into some thousands and thousands in numbers. And therefore, there is still need for maybe smaller. So there are, I'm sure we all have been following, there are new age banking licenses given, like a smaller bank, where there are limitations on the quantum of deposit raised, limitations on the quantum of loan given. So you might find these banks or these financial institutions keep getting licenses from the regulator to do more business, to make sure that there is enough circulation of money available in the country here, or like payment gateways. You will find these corporates to get the licenses to do more financing, as opposed to a conventional banking license. That should come only to somebody which is in the business of the financial activities, but not into industrial house or a corporate house. But it's a debate, it's a big debate here as to why will, let's say, Birla Group should not get a banking license. I mean, or Tata Group should not get a banking license, but they themselves are such large conglomerate and such large customer of banking, banking money. So if they themselves become bank, then who will keep a check and balance on these things,
Absolutely,
you, sir.
Thank you, sir. I just want to ask one more point in this question, sir. What is your view upon the bad banks? The bad bank which government of India is planning. So by the next year, it is basically believed that government of India is going to start the bad bank in our country. So basically, the issue is with the nomenclature. Actually, no bank is bad bank. The point is basically the restructuring kind of thing which government is planning. So how it will be helping out the Indian businessman, or you can say for the purpose of corporate restructuring. So do you think that this bad bank will be, you can say, a kind of this, you can say, better way to deal with these kind of consolidations in banking sector specifically?
I think they will have to still follow a case-to-case model. You will have to evaluate every bank on the basis of its performance here. I mean, if you look I can tell you there is a turnaround story to be spoken about in Yes Bank as to how it was handled, managed. I mean, you look at it's all publicly reported. You can take a look at that and how it is today. It's the same bank, is the same balance sheet, is the same loan. It is just, what the promoters or what the people at the realm of that business are doing with it. I mean, if you look at if you look at the reporting, how some loans were granted, where dealings were made with the promoters, how some promoters themselves got loan through the bank here indirectly. I mean, those endless stories needs to end. I mean, if somebody asked a question about, frauds here. This is how it happens. And therefore, a beautiful, super successful bank can also go down and can come back. It all, how you handle it, how you handle the business here. And therefore, I think before it can be tagged, if it can be rescued, that's the best thing, the way it's done today as well.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Now I would like to request Mr. Mosam to please ask your question.
Good morning, sir. Sorry. Good afternoon, sir. Sir, first of all, I would like to congratulate you and the whole team of SLS Noida for hosting such an event and such an insightful event. So, proceed with my question, Hardeep. My question pertains to the corporate restructuring that has happened in the past. Sir, in the past, CCI has approved many corporate restructuring transactions like Vodafone, Idea, or Flipkart, Walmart, or Reliance Jio. In all these cases, the AAC has been analyzed in current perspective only, but not regarding the future perspective, the combinations which are likely to cause AAC in future. So what are your views regarding this, sir?
No, they do look at both the current and the future impact on competition while approving any merger. It is part of the law. They have to keep in mind the present impact of any such merger, any such combination that's happening, which is before them for them to approve, and its impact in future. I think they do look at in future as well. And some of these large combinations that you're speaking about, or the mergers that you're speaking about, those were approved on the basis of its impact in future as well. They do take a look at that.
Okay, thank you.
But sometimes, if I can tell you, sometimes some of these, sometimes, not always. It's again a big debate with the regulator. Sometimes some of these future impacts of these combinations, at least in our country, are largely perceived. But in the world over, it can be very real. So what's happening? I'm sure you people must have read what's happening with Facebook. I think we did. Did we talk about it? I think we did. So what's happening with Facebook? There are some more than a dozen or close to a dozen of states in USA which are after Facebook to break it into 3 components. They want to break every part of Facebook into different components. And then there are various states and now European nation as well after Google to break it. Because what's happening is that when you do Google search today, obviously, there are different results. The debate is that some results could be, could be something which they want to show. It's rightly, wrongly, one doesn't know. But yeah, these are the allegations made all over the press. You can take a look at that. So it will always remain a debate. It is a big debate here as to what is right and what is wrong here. I think we did speak about Facebook at least last time, that why would somebody really want to break Facebook? It is not a necessity in nature. It is a luxury in nature. I mean, you don't need to use Facebook mandatorily. You use it to pass your time. It's a social, network site here. So why would you really go after a company like a Facebook? If somebody has to go, it can go after a company which is supplying water, supplying electricity, or something which is essential for living. But then the debate is that today social media companies are essential for living here. I don't know how they are so essential for people to live here, and therefore, I think these debates are never ending. But to answer you, yes, the Competition Commission do look at impact of any merger in any merger filing, the present impact and the future impact on the competition in the country.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Actually, I have one point in this regard when we talk about the CCI. No doubt that CCI basically considers both perspectives, because in the Competition Act it has been categorically mentioned that which causes or likely to cause appreciable adverse effect on competition. But just take an example, like for example, when Reliance Jio was basically offering these services at free of cost. So at that time there was a challenge in the CCI that this predatory pricing issue. But in that case, at the time, actually, I've gone through this entire judgment. So it was mentioned in that case that because there are a number of players in the market, because at the time there were Reliance Communications, there were Tata Indicom, Tata Docomo, there were Aircel, there were Uninor. But the point was this likely to cause. So even the parameters, more or less, they are applicable in case of combinations as well, which is given under section 5 and 6, right, with section 29, or as with section 20 actually. So my point is basically likely to cause. So what is the time frame basically which CCI considers? Because if we go by that particular case of Reliance Jio, the section for predatory pricing issue, and if we analyze the same things, like for example, no doubt that Walmart or Flipkart issue has not caused any AEC as of now, but in future, because ultimately when there are only less players in the market, so it basically creates a monopolistic kind of market. So don't you think that this likely to cause area should be broadened in this domain? So this is my point, sir. So what is your take upon this point, sir?
I think in a way that that's likely to cause any appreciable effect needs to be evaluated from a different perspective here. I've not examined this this particular matter, but I think there were some thresholds already prescribed, and it was still below that threshold for it to be falling within that sort of a restrictive category. But yeah, one has to examine this from a future perspective as well, and not just the present perspective. But then what are we saying? Are we saying that every company gaining size in the world is not good for the industry? Is this what we are saying? We can't say that. I think it's maybe conventional thinking is that every large company is not bad, but their practices could be. So one needs to focus on the practice of the large companies, not by creating a large size of the large company. So if we start saying that every large company can really impact the market, yes, they can. But are they doing good for the market? If the answer is yes, that is good only. So let's say why we speak so much about Google today. I think Google has done such wonderful thing for so many people. The access to information, the access to knowledge which Google has given. I mean, forget what people may say on the other way around, but the access that we all have got today, or to measure the traffic from home to a destination where you want to go, we never had that. We could not even conceive these things. We could not have imagined that one can just switch on the Google and check if I need to go to Noida, which is the best road to take, where is the traffic here, except for looking at the radio where some radio jockey will be telling us, at so-and-so crossing there could be a jam here, or some friend is calling you, don't go to that road. Today, the ease for every human being who is getting access to this technology is humongous. So therefore, I'm saying this debate can be never ending. We can keep criticizing these same companies which have eased our life so much. Now today, there was all the debate about, the Zoom or MS Team are storing our data, but how else can we, connect each other had they not been there. How else could have been possible, So yeah, we need to strike a very good balance here. We can't shut them off all of a sudden, and we can, I will not speak much about Jio, but we can speak about whatever we want to. End of the day, making a cheaper phone available to across 100-200 million Indians who could not have afforded a very expensive or high value phone is still a remarkable thing to just speak about. But yeah, you always have different debates on each part of it. So not that I am anti-social this thing, but I'm saying that we also need to always keep in mind that these are the companies which have eased up to a large extent the human lives, and that, in my view, maybe starting from Google, it can go up to Uber as well. I mean, today to catch a taxi, even when you are in Russia or you are in a country where you just don't know how to speak their language as well, it's so easy. You land, today in a country like in a place like Moscow, or you go to maybe Budapest, you just have to switch on Google, press it, that taxi will come. Don't have to talk to them. It's prepaid, and they'll drop you to your destination. The convenience is so much, which I'm not saying it should outweigh any monopolistic activities if they are getting engaged in that. But if they are not, then yeah, let them gain size so that they can serve everybody at a different level. And that number is never ending. And when you pick up any such company, I think we also spoke about last time why the valuation of some of these companies. Let's say we spoke about Airbnb, which got listed recently. I think last month it got listed. It had a valuation of $180 billion, which was 4 times the valuation of the largest hotel company in the world, which is Marriott, which also owns Starwood here. 4 times. Why? They don't own any hotel. They don't have any brand of their own, because they had given this ease of accessing thousands, hundreds of thousands of, available destinations or properties to people who wanted to stay in any area at a far different price point. And therefore they have, whatever they're getting.
Exactly, sir. But the point is, sir, nothing comes free, of course. So we have to be ready with this costing factor as well in the future.
That hit on the nail, right on the nail. It's not free. Maybe it's not costing us money. It's costing us freedom. It's costing us something else, and therefore regulators to do something more. See, some part we will have to let a regulator do that. Do not let them engage in extremely restrictive or, not in the correct sort of a practices.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Now I would like to request Ms. Anvi to please ask your question.
Good afternoon, sir. Am I audible and visible?
Yes, Anvi.
Sir, I'd like to thank you for such a wonderful session for all 3 of these masterclasses, especially for students who weren't very comfortable with the subject previously. I think it's been a wonderful experience for all of us. So especially thank you for that, sir. So, sir, again, my question deals with something a little more basic. So, how important is it to assess the synergy in an M&A transaction? And so we see that there are various cases of M&A transactions that are not very successful, and there are evidences that they face failures at many times. So, sir, why do you think such failures take place? And what, according to you, can be a better solution to deal with the failures of such transactions? So that's so thank you.
So my favorite phrase there is that mismatch of expectations can fail any transaction. Is that simple? Mismatch of expectations. I am expecting it to be X. You're expecting it to be X plus 3 or X minus 4. That mismatch can lead to a failure of anything that we want to do here. And therefore, the expectations needs to be aligned when when 2 parties are doing any transaction here. One is that. Secondly, which is the largest one. Secondly, there are sometimes some legal issues that can lead to also a failure of a transaction. Legal issues means that some fundamental environmental approvals are lacking for the venture to take off immediately. And therefore, until those approvals are in place, as an example, the investment cannot be made. Or sometimes the the trademark licenses or the trademarks or the brands or the copyrights or the intellectual property owned by the JV, by the target, is subject to some threatened litigation by third parties, whereby your perspective of that, that litigation or perceived litigation is different than the one by the owner of the target company. I mean, you think that this litigation can lead to erosion of value, but they may think that this may lead to only, some monetary claim not exceeding X rupees. Even that can be a mismatch, and that can bust the whole thing here. There could be various reasons, but yeah, just club in these 2 or 3 categories, and that's good enough reason for things to fall away. And in our experience, we don't lose hope. It happens that we have worked on, that's a very long time for a M&A deal to consummate, but yeah, sometimes we work 8, 9, 10 months and the deal doesn't go through. It happens for the reasons which you discover here, or sometimes we find that to do the deal, the charges imposed by the authorities in some cases are so they are prohibitive, or the stamp duties are prohibitive for the deal to occur, and therefore the deal doesn't happen. And even those lead to some sort of disheartening situations, but it keep happening. It just keep happening. And I heard someone say that people wants to practice corporate law here. I think it is again very important to stay fully informed of what's happening surrounding us in this corporate. I mean, very, very fully informed of what all is happening in this world insofar as the companies are concerned, which company is coming, which company is launching what. I mean, recently, I'm sure we must have heard that Apple is launching a car now. So you will find Apple car very soon. I mean, they were saying 2022 is their target to launch the car. And we heard Ola launching a scooter in India. These things will make you believe that we are again getting into a second phase. I don't know what you think, Ramal. I think we're getting into a second phase of a disruption very soon, when we can see a car coming from Apple, where we already have Tesla disrupting the entire business model of the conventional car companies. Or let's say Tesla today is valued at $600 billion, close to $600 billion. And all car companies in the world, including Mercedes or Volkswagen, which makes Audi, or BMW or Toyota or Ford, all put together are less than that value. And here you have Tesla making that value here, and here you have now Apple making cars. So what's going to happen in the world here, one doesn't know. So staying connected to what's happening around you and reading more about it, and then staying connected to the most dynamism in the corporate laws, which is usually happen in terms of your Companies Act, your FDI regulations, your SEBI regulations, all corporate laws, or all the case laws. Keeping yourself fully abreast to what's going on can get you ahead in the curve all the time. So not to miss out reading anything. And I think we did speak last time that there is so much information available today, so much data easily available today that you can just read about any case law at any point in time. Go to the Delhi High Court website, read about any top 5 cases that happened last year, download their orders, read this last 3-4 big orders. You will figure out what's happening there. Or even the reporting done by these publications is good enough, which is easily available. Sorry,
yes, may I make one comment here? As you talked about the word disruption, because many people do not like it, but this has been seen. If we see, and it has been shown into movies. There was a movie wherein Mr. Dilip Kumar acted. It was Naya Daur, and wherein it was shown that horse cart to be replaced by the motor vehicle.
Yeah.
And then we see that there are no horse carts anywhere in the cities anymore. But now it has become a luxury, and they are charging multifold, because if there is a horse cart and then they pay, you have to pay double. Like if you see, they have replaced. So as you rightfully talked about the vehicles as well. So earlier then we also talked about the petrol or the propelled or the diesel propelled, then the gas propelled, and now we are talking about electricity. So as it is advancing, so one gets replaced by the other, but what doesn't get replaced is that convenience one looks for. So what one brings convenience to, of course, people always go for that. There was another disruption which people were talking about, these e-commerce companies. If they come into the market, most of our small businesses will go out of business. And there was so much of opposition. But if you see now, big companies, and then now they are having their relationships so develop with the small vendors. Now small vendors, with the help of, like for example, Facebook, are able to sell their products as well. So this is another. So how do we look at it and utilize it than just opposing it makes really sense here. So on this point, may I just ask question, like for example, what's your opinion? Like Snapdeal and the Flipkart, that marriage could not happen. That just failed, but it led to another baby, Snapdeal 2.0. But one of the reasons so cited, rather there were two reasons suggested to be. One was the differential payout option, which was given to the investor. And second one was the non-solicit clause, which was for 5 years. So asked by Flipkart, because there were other investors who also had invested in other e-commerce companies, and which went against this entire transaction. And then happened what is called Flipkart and then the Walmart. But still, whether it is on a firm ground or it is on a shaky ground, because everybody knows the founders, and then something was found in their book of accounts, and then whole thing, that saga started. So what's your opinion about these clauses when it comes to, and if we make like business transactions, because you say that both have to agree, so it should suit to the greater extent of each other interest as well. So marriage of interest is most important aspect of what you said, sir. So what would be your opinion in this context about these two deals, and where the first one went wrong and where the second one is said to be little better than the first one?
See, this, in my view, this keep happening here. I mean, companies gaining value and then losing value, it keep happening. I mean, there are so many examples, and I'll give you more, but it can happen. And of course, it's all publicly reported as to how Snapdeal was valued into few billions, all of a sudden was left to even less, because I think I fully agree to what you said on the disruption here, that I don't want to add anything more. I think you gave very good example of Nayad, you made me speechless on that. I'm not against disruption. I was only giving examples of what's happening in the world, what more is happening here, and it'll keep happening. Of course, we have to be fully geared up, ready, and we have to also train our new lawyers to do something so disruptive in the field of law as well. Can we do something whereby there can be more usage of artificial intelligence or a real intelligence by lawyers in the name of AI? I think even that has to come. But even, let's say, if I can speak about the field of law, there are new, not new anymore, it's been now 7-8 years, there are these companies which are helping to manage litigations or multiple litigations of corporates through the software. Or there are these companies which are helping large corporates to do the compliance checks through software. So they have a software which tracks every compliance to be done by a running company, whether it's labor compliance or it's shops compliance or it's the normal licensing compliance that they have in place. So yeah, things are happening there as well. So we have to get ready to what may happen in future. We have to get ready. But I think I was more commenting on that we have to also be fully aware of what's going on surrounding us.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Now I would like to request Ms. Sanjri to please ask your question.
Good afternoon, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, Sanjri, you are audible and visible. Yes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, sir. First of all, I would like to thank you for such wonderful sessions. It's been really, really informative, especially because I was not very aware of all these, M&A transactions and the laws that are there. So thank you so much, sir. So my question for you, sir, is that in the regulation of transactions in almost every jurisdiction of the world, there are several regulators that operate to determine whether such transactions comply with the multitude of laws that are prevailing in that country. So India being no exception to the same, they have a host of regulators that grant approval to these transactions, and examples of these being like SEBI or IRDA or RBI or CCI. So given that there's been a widespread critique of India's complicated and often unnavigable regulatory landscape, what can be a better solution according to you to the regulatory conundrum that has been considered a hindrance in attracting investment from both India and also from other countries abroad across several sectors? So what could be the one solution that that you could give, sir, that could help with attracting investments in India from outside and also from India itself?
Yes, of course. Just give me 1 second. Sorry. Yes, of course. So there are, of course, several regulators involved, whose approval may be required for any corporate transaction in India. But it all depends if such transaction is falling within the ambit of a regulator or not. So as an example, your IRDA is applicable only when you are transacting in any insurance company and where you are meeting any threshold of a transaction which triggers the requirement to take approval from IRDA. Similarly, for SEBI, if we are into a listed company, if that listed company breaches a threshold of any merger of any takeover, only then there is a need to go to SEBI and take approval from SEBI in that sense. Otherwise, in a private transaction, which is within the exempted category of competition regulations in India, there is no need to take any approval today. So I can still tell you that around majority or super majority of transactions or super majority of corporate M&A transactions in India, they fall within the ambit of largely no approval category or no pre-approval category here. You will not find that every transaction is requiring approval from a regulator every time. You will find that majority of them does not require any approval because they move in a category where where the government departments or the governments have done away with any licensing or their approval requirement. So as an example, if you are buying out into any manufacturing company or any even if it is any e-commerce company or any company in this sort of ecosystem here, there is no need to take any approval, not required at all. Let's say if you're buying out into a financial services sector company, obviously beyond a threshold, if you buy into a NBFC, you may require approval of Reserve Bank of India, but then those are also largely matter of a procedure and it will be granted. And then for large investments to come from the foreign sources, from the foreign capital into India, largely barring few sectors, all comes within the automatic route. Automatic route is you can just simply come, make investment, and then report your investment to an authorized dealer of Reserve Bank of India within certain number of days of making investment. Means you can first come, invest, take shares, and then let your investing company make the reportings to Reserve Bank of India. It has been that, eased out. And I'm coming from an era, and I must tell you, when I, joined this firm here in 1995, if any foreign investment had to come to India, it had to undergo 3 key approvals. Let's say if at any point in time, if any foreign company had to invest into any shares in India, it had to first obtain approval from something called FIPB, Foreign Investment Promotion Board, which approval used to be a Herculean task to do. It was like a job to do. It was like an excitement for us to now go and get the government of India approval to get this, foreign investment in India from FIPB. After FIPB grants approval, you had to go to Reserve Bank of India to take in principle approval for bringing in the money. Then after in principle approval, you bring in the money and take final approval from Reserve Bank of India. This was the stage of every single dollar that had to come to India at that point in time. And today, as we know very well, FIPB is done away with. There is no prior approval at all anywhere. RBI is directly not involved in any of these investments. It's all done through the authorized dealers, which are these banks operating in India, where there are post facto approval requirements. So largely, barring these sector-specific regulators, most of the transactions in India, or a super majority, they do not by itself require any complicated regulatory approval. And again, for the competition commission, the approvals, unless we are really seeing very, very large transactions, super majority of them, even if they are breaching the threshold of exemption category of these competition, from the competition commission perspective, they are getting approved by, by the commission within the number of days given to them, which is I think some 45 days and all. They do approve these transactions very quickly, even if you're breaching a threshold, which is your 750 crore or 1,000 crore rupees of, I think turnover of whatever.
Thank you so much.
Things have changed, yeah, things have changed, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Sir, right now there are no questions from the audience right now as such, but I have only one question from my side, and which is not actually from my side, but it is on behalf of all students of M&A domain, because in Symbiosis Law School Noida, the students basically, many students, they have opted for the M&A subject. So on behalf of all those students, basically, I just want to ask your opinion, like what exactly these students or learners basically they are supposed to do, or they are supposed to go through, what kind of you can say like subjects, expertise, or the kind of knowledge which they should have to make their career in this domain. Because even our deputy director sir has also mentioned this point through chat box to me, that no doubt that nowadays the main question is it money involved in this merger or interest of the public, or is it like the interest or the area of the interest basically? So what exactly motivates the persons in this field and how to make their career in this field? So listening from you will be definitely a great help to all of them.
I see. Okay, few things. So what excites I'm sure only Ravandale can tell us what excites lawyers to be a corporate lawyer. I'm sure some part of glamour attached to it, some part of the money attached to it, and some part of excitement of do what we are doing part of it. I think it's a combination of various things. It's a combination of various things. So let's say there was some time, or there was a time when the compensation levels of corporate lawyers was far ahead of, let's say, litigation lawyers. But I don't think that's the case anymore these days. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think litigation is equally paying, or they also have caught up very well in the recent past, I must say. So it cannot just be money part of it, which can excite people to be a corporate lawyer versus a litigation lawyer. Although the money may not be same at the beginning for a litigation lawyer versus a corporate lawyer, because the beginning or the opening compensation levels of large law firms can still be very high or far higher than that of litigation lawyers. And it can remain like this for maybe 3-4 years, if I'm not wrong, after which the catch up is very quick between a litigation or a corporate lawyer here. But end of the day, I think what should motivate a lawyer to do or practice corporate law is the interest, is that basic interest of that learner that we have today. I mean, is this what you want to do, to be in the court and argue your matters, or is it what you want to do to advise these corporates, these companies, and handle this, corporate practice part of it? So I have actually worked in court for a few months before I joined, a corporate law firm. And at that point in time, the specie corporate law firm was negligible in existence in our country. And it was a point of sort of not looked high upon, that you are not doing litigation, you are working in a corporate law firm, which people says, what is it supposed to mean? But today things have changed, because there are larger and larger needs of these corporate law practices for compliances, for transactions, for advisory, for white collar, for anything else which is going on. And therefore it should be the interest that should come from somebody who wants to be part of it, whether you want to be in the courtroom or you want to be in the boardrooms. I mean, this is, the phrase people usually it is being, and this question can be not answered by just studying law. It can be best answered by, by that lawyer to, I think, spend at least few months in both the areas and get a feel of it, get a hang of it, as to what's going on in the court versus what's going on in the law firm practices here. And then secondly, I mean, I will not say that there is a less sort of a time requirement in any other profession. I can tell you the law profession is very demanding, is extremely demanding, So we have to get ready in our head that we have to give that commitment to our profession, which is far ahead of anything else. That is very, very important today, This commitment to profession is, are we there? I think I lost all the screen.
Sir, actually, because of the light, so we are here only.
Yeah. So this commitment to profession is far ahead for a legal professional here. So your decision to do corporate law should be as to whether you really want to pursue corporate to be a corporate lawyer and therefore work in a corporate law firm. That has to be there, and not just the money factor, which is obviously which is there, which could be wonderfully far ahead otherwise. But yeah, you need to just keep this thing in your mind that you want to do corporate law. And secondly, I always believe in one thing, it may be that 100 things in life. I think it's the most important is that how can you use one or two out of it best when you practice. And I always believe that even if you learn some lectures on Shastras, I think you can use them the best when you practice law. So you need to know as to, and you need to learn as to how best you can use your learnings. And nothing wrong in, learning Shastras. And I can still share a story with you that we had one professor when I was, studying law in Campus Law Center, Professor Morana. He used to come and, start in a class that everybody else can teach you law, but I would like to teach you today one chapter on Shastras. And you can't forget these things, end of the day. Why? Because, you need to learn it quickly in your life, that it's not the few sections of Contract Act that can, get you to where you want to reach. It is how well can you use what you may have learned that can get you to, where you want to reach here. So using what you know and using while thinking on your toes, and I said, I spoke about interweaving what all you need to know and presenting it back is what can, get you the trick here. So therefore, for all of our learners, keep their eyes and ears very open and do not shut your eyes, ears to anything that is a learning in a day. I mean, we all learn, even I learn every day in my life. So keep learning and keep learning how to use your learnings when you perform, when you have to really, deliver the result here. And that, again, I'm saying that goes back to how well you would know your, your Mahabharata or your Ramayana or your any part of your Shastras or anything else that you learn. Is that simple? And a lot of things that I learned, I still is there in my mind. Maybe I'll give some more stories next time, especially that I learned on on Shastras, which are so important for any practice. But you have to keep that in your mind all the time, so that you should not forget those when you have to deliver.
So, in this direction, when you are saying about Mahabharata or Ramayana, so my only last question is basically, like as in Mahabharata, as advised by Shri Krishna to Pandavas, that they should prepare for this forthcoming situation. So I only request you to please advise these students, like what kind of tools, or basically we talk about in the terminologies of the Mahabharata, what kind of hatiyar basically they should have with them to enter into this boardroom or enter into this courtroom war kind of situation. So what is your suggestion, sir? Because the point is, in mergers and acquisitions, it is not only single subject. Actually, it is an amalgamation of everything in corporate law basically. So it includes everything, like whether it is company law, it is securities laws, it is competition law, be it income tax, be it any kind of other taxes. Even it includes stamp duty as well. So there are a lot of provisions of stamp duties. So the point is, if a student basically, if he has to deal with such kind of situation of M&A, where they are supposed to cover these kind of domains. So what is your advice to those learners in this regard?
Is as I think I said it, they have to learn to use their learnings. Therefore, whatever is being taught at any point in time, they have to keep their eyes, ears, mind fully open, and keep learning out of it. And they cannot turn. So, as a corporate lawyer, I cannot tell a client that I don't know about the taxes. I think today we can cut out any tax statutes or any tax part of any transaction and that makes us ahead in the game here. I mean, my managing partner, best tax consultant in the country, and because of me working so closely with him, I mean, our knowledge on tax is so high that tax consultant will have to come to the till that time we'll handle all parts of tax, and that includes income tax, withholding tax, could be your double taxation avoidance treaty. That's only one part of it. At the same time, our own domain knowledge of the sector that we gain by reading the game here. At the same time, whenever we do a transaction here, we will always try whatever we learn here, the learning and then using it again. And therefore, so what we do is that we let our fresh law graduates to work on due diligences. Now, due diligence is, in my view and in my experience, has been the most learning experience for our lawyers. Why most learning? Because in a due diligence, they will look at the corporate side of the company, which means all their corporate compliances, all their shareholding directors. From there, they'll move to the human resource part of it, where they look at all the labor laws, all conceivable labor laws or human resource laws here. From there, they'll move into the intellectual property part of it, where they look at all the IPRs, licenses part of it. They'll move to the licensing part of any industry here, look at all license consents approval, and so on and so on. So a due diligence can be the best learning start or best start to learn all various aspects of the multiplicities of these laws that get into any advice that you give it. I think that's the fun part of it that I find, is that you may keep learning one, let's say, curriculum as one statute, but in any corporate practice or corporate M&A, it cannot just be one statute. It will have to be a combination of several, multiple interwoven statutes, which needs to be kept in mind when you are doing a transaction here. You just cannot miss out on, your financial services sector requirement, your insurance requirement, your, competition requirement, your tax requirements end of the day, or your foreign investment guidelines requirement here, or anything else. It keeps working, from start to finish here. But, all these are, again, there is no, I always say that Google search is no match to the experience. It may be a beginning of it, but you just can't Google search and tell me that I also know the answer to the same question because I had done a Google search on it. No, you cannot. So please don't confuse the Google search with experience ever. We can never confuse the Google searches with the experiences that you gain while you work. So on-life experiences is what you need to always, keep dwelling more and more on.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for this wonderful, insightful session. And as a faculty of this domain, M&A, I can simply say only one thing. That's why M&A is not actually mergers and acquisitions. It is basically master of all. So the point is, once you are in this domain, so you cannot simply say, I do not know this particular field, because you are supposed to be you can say the person who knows all these things, because M&A includes everything. So on behalf of Symbiosis Law School Noida, I'm so thankful to you, because in these 3 sessions, actually you covered everything about M&A. That's why it has been named as masterclass. So without taking any time, I will just hand over the session to Director sir. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rajneesh, for moderating the sessions on all 3 days. And of course, the credit of making these sessions possible goes to Mr. Hardeep, who has been such a close friend and has been so supportive of the initiatives at the law school. When we use the word due diligence, most of the people forget that they have to be diligent, because due diligence is not an activity which just takes place, but people have to do it. And I remember the school days, and when we used to go, like we are talking about the market, so it comes in any form. So even if we visit a wholesaler or we visit a small shop, they used to welcome us with a picture, which was always at their back. And it was about it was written there, Aaj Nagad Kal Udhar. So people were informed before they enter that you have to be diligent. You have come to a place where it's a commercial transaction, no more relations. And even like, for example, if you go to the titles of the movies, they were so diligently carved out. And today I don't find that that diligence is there at all. Well, it may be because I love the old movies more than the latest movies. But like the movies like Kal Aaj Aur Kal, like, it is to convey everything to us in just one line. There we never required the disclaimers because the things were clear, because it was always said it's a movie. But now you have to write disclaimers. So when we are talking about business, when we talk about transactions, what lies beneath is the diligence. And the diligence is not about just business transactions, about the laws as well. And as it has been highlighted, has been so aptly informed by Mr. Hardeep to all of us in all 3 sessions. If people have taken the notes, because in the very first session, Mr. Hardeep had informed us that you need to also know what is going around. It is not just the classroom, not what you are learning, but there is so much learning which is happening in the environment where you are. So like if we are talking about business, he made one point very clear that you may be reading, for example, Economic Times or the Financial Times or the Business World. What he tried to hint, because we should be aware of what's happening. And if somebody is asking something, then you should be able to respond to those situations as well. And that's what you rightfully said. So all these 3 sessions and the kind of questions I could see raised by the learners, they were quite interesting. And the session, of course, was made possible because of the efforts. Many may not know, but let me put it on record. These sessions were an initiative of Mr. Hardeep. It happened because he agreed, and he always had shown this willingness to come to the campus, share these experiences. As he rightfully said, these are interactive sessions for which if the audience is present before you, and then you have, so most of these questions come because you are able to read from the gestures, etc., and then the right kind of question could be asked. So of course, as we start in the physical space, which we see as a possibility maybe in the next year. So we again will go with this request to Mr. Hardeep, and then we'll have this session in the real time. But yes, for this, we would not be having this in the classroom. Rather, we will keep it in the auditorium so more number of people can come, and they can come from different parts, different things, and then they can have this interactive session. So thank you very much, sir. You always have been so kind to us, and you gave so much time to all of us, and we could learn from this. And hope to continue with this learning initiative going in the coming year as well. And as you always are there for us as we need, we make this promise as and when it is required. All of us at the law school are ready to assist as and when the need arises. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.